I think one of the things that irritates us a lot is when members of our own community, and I say that in the broadest sense, not necessarily the people who attend the same shul as us, but members of the broader Jewish community, when they are the ones who cause issues for the Jewish community, and when they're the ones who speak the loudest against us or in favor of our enemies. It's very uncomfortable, it's very unpleasant, and it can really get you very worked up. So I don't know if we're necessarily going to resolve in today's conversation how we deal with people who are, I don't like the word self-hating Jews, because that's a very loaded expression, but I don't know if we're going to necessarily resolve how to deal with those people who cause real damage to the Jewish community. But what we are going to talk about, and perhaps you could extrapolate it out to speak to these people as well, is how do you deal with those people who are just disconnected, disinterested, and means nothing in their lives. As far as they're concerned, there is nothing significant about being Jewish. Maybe they have a cynical attitude. Maybe they even give a lot of pushback. You know, we all have our circle, and we all have our relative position in that circle. You know what that means? It means like this. Being frum, and I hate that word because it's such a loaded word, is the equivalent to driving on the highway, where basically everybody who's in front of you should have their license revoked because they're driving too slowly, and everybody behind you is a meshuggah who's trying to run you off the road. And it's a similar kind of thing. You know, what's considered to be frum? Depends who you ask. I can assure you now, every one of us has in our circle somebody who looks at us as the religious one in the family, and every one of us has in our circle somebody who looks at us as the black sheep religiously in the family. And it's all relative. When I say family, it could be your friend's circle as well. You know, it's not necessarily a family thing. So we all have people who we have to deal with that by our standards of what we feel Judaism should be about, these people are just not towing the line. They've gone a step too far. They've disconnected too much. They are too cynical, you know, or something along those lines. Question is, how do we deal with those people? What should our attitude be towards those people? Okay, what do you say? Cut them off. Yeah. Cut them off. That's sometimes easy in principle. That's it. I'll have nothing to do with them. They are the problem. I'm okay as long as I'm investing in myself, as long as I'm growing. That's good enough. They're the problem, right? But the question is, number one, is that actually acceptable from a Jewish perspective? But a deeper version of that question is, well, what does it mean to be Jewish? Now, I'll tell you why that's a significant part of this conversation is because is it good enough to be Jewish in my space and then to say, and there are other people who have made their choices, they've gone down their path, it's their business, it has nothing to do with me. In other words, when we ask this question about how we're supposed to respond to those individuals who are on the fringes, we're not only asking a question about them. Are we supposed to be accepting of them? Are we supposed to tolerate them? Are we supposed to embrace them? We're actually asking a question about ourselves. Who am I? What kind of a person am I supposed to be? What does the Torah expect of me in terms of who I am? Am I allowed to satisfy myself with my own personal development or the people in my circle? As long as we're good, our family is good, we've established a standard for ourselves and that's good enough for us, and everybody else must sort themselves out? Or do I have some level of responsibility to everybody else? And notice I'm saying to everybody else because I think we all feel that a sense of responsibility to some. There's some people who have a sense of responsibility to. But do we have a sense of responsibility to everybody? Even to those people who get on our nerves, seem to have turned their back on Judaism, or perhaps are even causing damage to the Jewish cause. That's really the question over here. And, you know, right now, I think we're in such a sensitive time in Jewish history because of the things that are happening to us, both in Israel and globally, that it's sensitized us to these things and to how, you know, if you're not willing to stand with your own community at a time like this, then it makes us wonder, you know, well, what kind of a person are you? We're under assault, and there are those people who side with the others or excuse their behavior or just want to be neutral. And this is not a time to be neutral. Like, you really have to step up to the plate. We've got to declare our intentions or declare our allegiances. That's kind of what's happening in the world right now. So it's quite a significant conversation. And in order to understand, to get a sense, where do you think the best place would be to start? In other words, where are we going to find a template in our history to work out like what Jews are supposed to be? Where do you think we were told what we're supposed to be? Or when? When do you think we were told what we're supposed to be?
Well, when we got the 10 Commandments.
Well, that's what everybody's going to say, right? When we got the 10 Commandments. In other words, that's when we were given the introduction to being Jewish, to the Torah, which is our guide to life. So surely that's when we were told what it is that we're supposed to do. The truth is, it actually starts a couple of steps before that. And that's why I specifically put it out as a question, because by default, obviously, we're going to go to the Sinai experience because that's when we're given instructions. The truth is, it starts earlier because it's on the road to Sinai that we become a nation. And that's when we're given the guidance about what it means to be part of this Jewish nation. And there's certain things that you have to do. If you don't do these things, you're not part of the Jewish nation. So, for example, those people who had absolutely no faith in Moshe, when Moshe came and told them that they're going to leave Egypt, they didn't buy the story, they completely rejected it, they didn't leave. Because you have to declare some degree of buy-in. Like, if you don't buy into the story, you're not part of the story. Now, effectively, that also changes after the Torah was given, because after the Torah was given, there's really no escape clause, and as hard as we try maybe sometimes to run away from our Jewish identity, the unfortunate or fortunate reality is a Jew is a Jew is a Jew, and there's nothing you can do to escape it. And as we've been learning in Tanya, sometimes it just leaps out at you when you least expect it, and then suddenly you have to behave in accordance with your Jewish values, even if you've tried to escape them from your whole life. So that's one of the principles. But there's another very interesting principle about the story of the Exodus from Egypt, which is what we're going to focus on today, that when you first read the story, quite honestly, it seems like a very insignificant sidebar to the story. We're talking about these massive moments, miracles, plagues, the destruction of the world superpower Egypt, the escape of millions of slaves, the establishment of a new people who are going to be the chosen nation. There's such big issues happening that when the Torah inserts what seems like just a trivial detail, you have to ask yourself, well, why did you put that detail into the story? So here's a trivial detail, okay? The Jews leave Egypt. We know that part of the story. We also know that Pharaoh's going to chase after them, and they're going to land up at the edge of the sea, and there's going to be the great miracle of the splitting of the sea. These are major chapters in our story. In the midst of all of this, we get told this information. And I'd like you to just think for a moment, how important does this sound to the story? Moshe takes the remains of Yosef with them when they leave Egypt. Okay? Got that? He takes the remains of Yosef with them when they leave Egypt. Now, how important do you think that is to the story? Does it sound important?
Yes.
Why is it so important?
Because it is the basics that we overlook.
But why is it important to the story of the Exodus?
Yes, because he never really belonged in Egypt. He was taken there in order for certain things to happen.
Okay, fair enough. That still doesn't explain why it's integral to the story of the Exodus. That's just telling me Joseph was like everybody else who didn't really belong in Egypt, and therefore they all had to come out. And I just want to point for the record to the fact that it wasn't only Joseph's remains that they took out of Egypt, it was the remains of all of his brothers as well. So why is there this emphasis on the fact that they took his remains out of Egypt? Now, I want to also put it into context, because where the Torah tells us things is also particularly relevant. So the Torah is telling us that the Jews leave Egypt, and then it tells us that Hashem does not take them on the most direct route out of Egypt. Now, that's very important to the story, because from Egypt to Israel is not a great distance. And if the objective is to take us from slavery to the promised land, well, then take us on the quickest route, don't you think? But the Torah specifies that Hashem dafka took us on a circuitous route that would keep us in the desert. At that point, we were not necessarily going to be in the desert for 40 years. We know that that's a problem that develops later. But still, we were going to go in this route that was kind of convoluted through the desert in order to get to the Red Sea and from there to Israel. So the Torah maps it out. Now, while it's telling us that information, which is basically plotting the route, that's where it tells us, and they took Joseph's remains. So now, not only does it seem like it's an insignificant piece of information to the broader story, but it also seems to be misplaced. Why here? Why is it relevant to this part of the story? Unfortunately, the last few weeks we've seen one after the other aviation accidents. And one of the things, obviously, that comes out, at least in that mid-air collision, between the helicopter and the plane, is who's plotting the course? Who's deciding where you're going? Now, this is the part of the story where we're plotting the course. And it's really important to plot that course properly, because if you don't, you could land up in very unhealthy places. So here the Torah is telling us, this is where they're going to go, and this is how it's going to happen. And then in the middle of that, and they take Joseph's remains with it. What's it got to do with it? It almost sounds like there's something about carrying Joseph's remains that is integral not only to the story of the Exodus, but specifically to the route that they were going to take out of Egypt. Now, some of the commentaries try and offer explanations for this. For example, they say that when they got to the sea and they were trapped between the sea in front of them and the Egyptians behind them, so there is a commentary that says, Midrash that says, that it was when the sea saw the coffin with Joseph's remains, that's why it split open. It was in the merit of Joseph that the sea split open. So that would explain, why we're telling the story at this particular point, because we need to know the connection between having Joseph with them and the fact that the sea was going to split. That's one opinion. There's a different opinion that says that they hadn't yet gotten to Sinai. Now, we do know that once they get to Sinai and they get the Torah gets put into, in those days it was the tablets, right? Gets put into the ark, and the ark has to be led in front of them, and that ark helped to fend off their enemies and keep the environment safe. So there's another view that says until they got the ark, Joseph's coffin created that protection for them. So now that they're going into the desert, you realize that they need protection. So that's why it's important to understand that Joseph's remains come with them. Okay, so those are decent explanations, but they're not really going to speak to the heart of what it is that we've got to unpack over here. And in order to unpack it, let's play a little bit of how good is your Hebrew. Okay, so in Hebrew, there are different ways that you could refer to somebody. In fact, you don't even have to use Hebrew. You know what? Before we get to the Hebrew, let's make this simpler. If you're describing somebody who's being exhumed from point A and taken somewhere else, so let's say we take somebody out of West Park and we want to reinter them in Israel, right? It happens. There are people who do that. They get buried here, and at a particular point in time, they then get exhumed and taken to Israel to be buried in Israel. Okay? Or let's say, God forbid, you hear these stories, they find the remains of people in Gaza, and now they bring them back to bury in Israel. Okay? So in English, how would you say this? You say, we are bringing so-and-so back to bury them in Israel. That's how we talk. It's a little disrespectful, don't you think, to say, we're bringing so-and-so's bones. I mean, that may be the fact, but that's not how you talk. It's disrespectful. And even if you do want to say something along those lines, you can say their remains. That's a little bit more dignified than saying their bones. Yet, when the Torah tells us that Moshe took Yosef's remains, it says he took Yosef's bones. Now, why? Why choose what sounds like a little bit of a disgraceful reference? Say, they took Joseph with them. Joseph, the man who saved them at this critical time when there was a famine in Egypt and the family was falling to pieces. And he brought everybody back together and he put them on their feet and he ensured that they had a good pasture land that they could keep their sheep. And he actually paved the way to soften the blow of the Egyptian exile. After all of that, why do you call him bones? They took Joseph's bones. Just keep it, respectful. Say, we took Joseph with us out of Egypt, especially when you consider that it's in his merit, according to one view, that the sea is going to split, and according to the other view, it's in his merit that they'll be protected in the desert. Then speak nicely about the man. Why does it say his bones? Now, if you are a scholar of the Tanakh, of the Bible, then you'll know, well, actually, he was the one who used that reference, because before he passed away, Joseph said to the Jews at the time, one day Hashem is going to send you somebody who will take you out of Egypt, and at that time I want you to take my bones with you. So you see, he is the one who referred to himself as bones. But do you really think that's a good enough reason for us to use an undignified expression? Not so much, right? You know, if a person wants to be self-denigrating, that's their business. But when we speak about people, we should always show respect. So the Torah should have used a much more respectful way to refer to Joseph and say, they took Joseph's coffin, they took Joseph's remains, anything other than to say his bones. And this is where we need a bit of a Hebrew expert. So how do you say bones in Hebrew? Right?
His integral meaning.
Okay, good. So let's first get the Hebrew, and then we'll be able to unpack it and get to that point. So what's the Hebrew for a bone? The singular of a bone is etzem, and the plural for a bone is atzamot. Okay, and in this reference, it says they took atzmot Yosef. That's how you say when it's a conjunction, the bones of Yosef. Now, Hebrew is a fascinating language because many words in Hebrew have multiple meanings, and those meanings are all related to each other. Now, if you think just purely from a perspective of human anatomy, what is the importance of the skeleton to the human being? That's a funny question to ask, right? What's the importance of your skeleton?
What holds you up?
It holds you up, right? If, God forbid, there's a problem with the skeleton, then the person can't function, and they can't survive. So the whole inner structure of a person is their skeleton, is their bones. So that says what you were saying about being the integral part of who the person is. That's what a person's bones are. The bones are the integral part of who they are. In fact, just not only humans, animals as well, right? The skeleton of an animal keeps the animal together. So, for example, when it comes to the Pesach offering, when you had to eat the Pesach sacrifice, you're not allowed to break a bone because that implies that you're, in a sense, damaging the animal. Because a bone is seen as the structural integrity of a human being. That's who we really are. Our bones are who we are. We use these expressions. People use things like they say, I can feel it in my bones. Now, you don't feel things in your bones, but the implication is that this is something that's really affected me very, very deeply, right? In Hebrew, the word etzem, which is the word for bone, is also the same word that we use for the essence. So the etzem of something is the essence of something. And because the Torah chooses to tell us that they took the atzmois Yosef, the bones of Yosef, out of Egypt, really what the Torah is telling us is this is not just about the exhuming of his remains so that he can be buried in Israel, even though that is important because that's going to honor our promise to him. It's telling us if you want to build a Jewish nation, you need the essence of who Joseph is to be part of who you are if you want to become the new Jewish people. He is, in many respects, and we're just going to really focus on one of them today, but in many respects, Joseph is the archetype of what it is to be a successful Jewish person. In fact, it's interesting, the only person in the whole of the Tanakh that is referred to as successful is Joseph. Vayehi ish matzliach. He became a successful man. Very interesting. So what does it mean to be a successful person? Well, the reason we'd want to model ourselves, let's try work it out. Why would you want to model yourself after Joseph? Out of all the great people in our history, what is there about Joseph that leaps out at you, that puts him into a category of his own? And there might be more than one thing that differentiates Joseph from other people.
Well, he went to a place where he was prosecuted and then he became in charge.
Exactly. So there's a very important lesson about Joseph. That here's a man who went through terrible persecution and oppression, both from his own family and from strangers. So first his own family turn on him, his brothers. Then he becomes a slave of other people, strangers. Then he is taken into Potiphar's home, a stranger, where he builds a reputation, but eventually is caught in a libel against him, lands up in prison, again with strangers, until eventually he becomes this most powerful man in the entire region at that time, probably the most powerful man in the world. So that's a great lesson for us because unfortunately, Jewish history is going to be filled with persecution and with oppression. So it's quite important to model ourselves after a person who doesn't need to live in a perfect environment and can succeed nonetheless. So we need to take that with us, right? We need to take the essence of Joseph with us, because if we're going to live the Jewish story, we're going to need that resilience. We're going to need that secret of being able to succeed in the most adverse circumstances. That's really important. Okay, what else do we know about Joseph?
Well, just, and this may be off topic, it's almost like Egypt didn't deserve his essence. They didn't deserve his birth.
Good. So let's unpack that a little bit further. So what do you mean that Egypt didn't deserve his essence? Why do you say that?
Because he helped Egypt become successful and
Right.
his own people were prostitutes.
Okay, so you're going to say that after Joseph, the Egyptians misbehaved. That doesn't tell us why Egypt didn't deserve him. That tells us why afterwards they behaved badly. Well, then when you say that Egypt didn't deserve Joseph, it sounds like from the moment he arrived there, they already didn't deserve him. And I agree with that. The question is why? Why would you say that Egypt is a place that does not deserve somebody like Joseph?
It's not holy land.
Exactly. Because Egypt is the most depraved society of the time. The Torah calls it Ervas Haaretz, which means the most immoral place on earth. And Joseph is not only born of a very holy family, not only is his father Yaakov, who's such a great person, and obviously he studied with him, and everything he knew about life he learned from his father, but he's also the favorite son, which essentially means not that there was favoritism in the classical sense. It means that he is the one who most expresses Yaakov's reality. That's why Yaakov sees in him such incredible, like a reflection of himself. So somebody of that caliber doesn't really belong in a place like Egypt, which is such a messy cesspool of nonsense. He doesn't belong there. So that's the deeper message to his success. It's not only that he succeeds in the sense that he rises to prominence and he has a lot of power and he has great authority, and that in spite of the fact that he's in a foreign environment, it's that he is able to preserve his value system even in that space. And it's very important to note this, because if you compare Joseph to his brothers, they have a completely different approach to their spiritual development. His brothers were all shepherds. And the shepherd life is the exact opposite of the political high life. Think about it. What's it like to be a shepherd? You essentially are in solitude. You don't have to worry about materialism. You spend yourself in a quiet environment. You spend your time in a quiet environment. You're surrounded by sheep. They don't cause any problems, you know what I mean? They don't challenge you in any meaningful spiritual way. So if you, for example, wanted to dedicate your life to meditation and to prayer and to working on your character, the shepherd's life is ideal because there are very few disturbances. Joseph, on the other hand, is in the fast lane. He's surrounded. Can you imagine? And unfortunately, when we read these stories, very often what we do is we just read the highlights of the story, and we don't pause to think about what the story was really like. So how many state dinners do you think Joseph had to attend in his career? Many, right? And not only with the heads of the Egyptian society, but probably all kinds of pagans who were coming from all over the place, paying homage to whichever particular idols it was. I don't know what level of promiscuity was common at those big state events, but he had to participate. And to retain his authentic spiritual self in that environment is a massive achievement. And that's what we have to take out of Egypt. If we want to be Jewish people, that's what we have to take out of Egypt, because Jews are not always going to live in Mea She'arim in Jerusalem. For most of our history, we've lived in very hostile environments, not only physically hostile, spiritually hostile environments, where it's not necessarily so easy to do what Jewish people are supposed to do. So we need to take Joseph with us into this journey, because if we're going to go into the desert, and the desert obviously is highly symbolic, a desert is an environment that's not really for human habitat, so that implies that spiritually a desert is a place that we don't belong. You want to go out into the desert, you want to survive the desert, you want to succeed in the desert, you need Joseph to come with you. But while all of those components are true reflections of who Joseph is, that's not his essence. These are very important achievements in his life, but we haven't yet captured his essence. Now, very often that happens, right? When we engage with people, we latch on to something about that person and we think, okay, now I know who you are. So, for example, somebody is gracious to us, so we tell everybody they're such a wonderful person. We don't necessarily know who they are. We might gather up all kinds of information about an individual without necessarily knowing their essence. So we've got to get to Joseph's essence. The fact that he survives hostility, the fact that he thrives despite oppression, the fact that he retains his authentic spirituality even in a depraved environment are all very great accolades, but they're not yet his essence. Now, where's the best place to look if you want to understand somebody's essence? Where would you start?
Well, the way they treat other people.
Again, the way that people treat other people may not be their essence. For example, there are people, I don't know if you've ever encountered them, who are really good at making you feel good without actually caring about you.
But for Joseph, he forgave his brothers.
Correct. So he forgave his brothers, which is a massive thing, and it shows us not only his acceptance of the fact that Hashem runs the world, and therefore whatever happens in our lives is part of our growth, and don't blame the people because it's the situation that Hashem wanted you to go through, and there's a great lesson in that, but that doesn't necessarily describe his essence. We've got to work out, where do you start looking if you want to capture somebody's essence, or for that matter, where do you start looking if you want to capture the essence of anything in Judaism? Where's your first clue to the essence of anything? Where's the first place you're going to look? You always look at the name. If the Torah gives a name to something, that name is supposed to represent the essence of what that particular thing is all about. Okay, so for example, the name Torah comes from the word instruction. So we should recognize that the essence of the Torah is to instruct us how to live our lives, not necessarily to tell us the history of the time or other interesting anecdotes. It's to teach us how we're supposed to behave. If the Torah gives somebody a name, that name is their essence. So for example, Moshe, the Torah calls him Moshe. That's not his name from his parents. That's his name from Pharaoh's daughter. His parents gave him a different name. The Torah doesn't even tell us what those names were, right? There were multiple names that each of his family members gave him. The Torah doesn't even refer to him by any of those names. It picks the name Moshe, even though that was a name that was given to him later on by the daughter of Pharaoh, because that's the name that captures his essence. So we have to ask ourselves, Yosef, how did he get his name? Remember, at that point in history, we're told why people are given their names, in most cases, right? Yaakov, because he's holding on to his brother's heel, which is his okev. Reuven, because Leah says, see how my son is so special. Reu means to see, etc. So, how does Yosef get his name? Remember that Rachel had battled infertility for many years. And she's waiting, watching her sister have baby after baby, and she's not blessed with children. And then she takes her half-sister and gives her half-sister to Yaakov as a wife, and she has children. And then Leah gives the other half-sister, and she has children. And all the while, Rachel is totally embittered by the fact that she can't have children. Eventually, she has a son. What does she name him? Yosef. And she says, the reason I'm calling him Yosef is Yosef Hashem li ben acher. Because my prayer is, may Hashem add to me another son. Now that might sound a little ungrateful. You know, you've waited and waited and waited and waited, and eventually now you have a child, and this child should be your blue-eyed boy, and it should be the biggest nachas in your world, and you should be so excited. What does she say? Hashem, please give me another son. Now there's something odd about what she says, because if her request is to have another son, she knows prophetically that there's supposed to be 12 tribes. Her son is now the 11th son of Yaakov. So there's one more to go. So she wants another piece of the pie, essentially. She doesn't want to have any less than any of the other sisters. So she's asking for another son. That could all be true. But then the language that she uses should be, Yosef Hashem li ben. Hashem, add a son. But she adds this word acher. Acher is a strange word. Acher means other. It could even mean foreign. It could, right? You could say that somebody is an acher. They don't belong. They're not part of us. They're an acher. They're someone else. They're an outsider. So it's really strange that not only is she asking for an additional child, but she's kind of highlighting that this additional child might actually be acher, might actually be an outsider. Now she already has one son who's an outsider, right? Yosef is already going to be an outsider. So what is she saying? That she wants a child who's going to be an outsider. There's a very disturbing commentary on this. And the commentary says that she was praying for a man called Yeravam ben Nevat, who was going to be a descendant of Joseph's family. Yeravam, for context, so you might remember that initially there was a Jewish kingdom established by King David that was the Jewish kingdom of the whole of Israel. But it didn't last very long. It lasted for King David's rulership, and then it lasted for King Solomon. After King Solomon passed away, there was a big fight. He had a son called Rehoboam, and there was another man called Yeravam. Rehoboam was the heir to the throne, and Yeravam, who was a descendant of Joseph's family, led a rebellion to establish his own kingdom. And it was at that point in time that the Jewish kingdom split in two, what was called the northern kingdom of Ephraim and the southern kingdom of Judah. This Yeravam is the guy who launches that civil, I don't want to say civil war, it wasn't yet a civil war, but that split between the two kingdoms that in turn resulted in many decades of conflict. He's responsible for that, and there's a commentary that says this is what Rachel was praying for. Now, Yeravam, in his attempt to establish his kingdom, realized that the biggest weakness his kingdom had was that everybody else was going to go to the south to pray in the Beis HaMikdash, to pray in the temple. So he decided to make a temple of his own. And he decided to make a temple with golden calves. I mean, how bad could you get? And he is recorded in history as the ultimate example of somebody who led thousands of others astray, because he got people to come and pray in his temple. Now, why on earth would Rachel, when she's finally got this child, pray for someone like that? Sounds strange, right? I mean, can you think of an example of somebody who is worse in terms of the damage that they do to the Jewish community than a man like Yeravam? Like I say, he is recorded in history as the ultimate example of the antithesis of Moshe. Moshe invested in bringing everybody into the fold, and Yeravam invested in driving everybody out of the fold. Why would Rachel daven for this guy? Out of all of the potential descendants that Joseph is going to have, this is the guy she's davening for? She's not just davening for him. She's saying that this is the essence of what Joseph is. Yeah. The essence of Joseph is that you go, Yosef Hashem li ben acher. That Hashem should add to me a child, ben acher, who previously was an outcast. You take the outcast and you make them a child. That's the essence of Joseph. The essence of Joseph is to recognize that if there's somebody within our circle, somebody within our community, who has, by choice, sidelined themselves, by choice, aligned themselves with the other side, like Yeravam did. He aligned himself with idolatry, which is the antithesis of Judaism. When there's somebody who makes a choice that to us is so hurtful and so, just gets under our skin, that person who is acher, that person who we're quite happy to say they don't belong, they should be excised from the Jewish community, they should be excommunicated, they should no longer be considered Jewish. Joseph is the person who says, how do you turn them into a brother? Now, he did that with his own brothers, right? His own brothers had turned their backs on him. His own brothers had rejected his prophetic insights, because his dreams were not just dreams, they were prophetic insights. His own brothers had written off, 22 years of his life that he couldn't engage with his own father. His mother had passed away, but he couldn't engage with his own father. He couldn't engage with the whole spiritual experience of the Jewish community. He had to fend his way through the darkness of Egypt. He could well have said, you guys, you've done so much evil to me. You've done so much damage to me. I want nothing further to do with you. And he probably would have been justified. But he took the exact opposite path, as you said. His path was he's going to embrace his brothers. And he's going to forgive his brothers. And he's not only going to forgive them, but he's going to help them deal with their guilt. Fascinating, because the brothers, as soon as Yaakov passes away, they come literally groveling at Joseph's feet, saying, please forgive us. Yaakov, our father, said that after he passes away, you should take no retribution against us. They are carrying a massive amount of guilt, and it's Yosef who deals with it. He's the one who says, what do you think? You couldn't harm me. It was completely out of your hands. This is what Hashem has decided. He contextualized their suffering. He helped deal with their guilt. It's an incredible thought. So here we are. We're on the eve or at the beginning of the journey of becoming the Jewish people. We're leaving Egypt. We now have to establish a nation. We know that we're going to go into a desert, meaning a place that's going to bring many spiritual challenges, including challenges from within our own ranks. It's critical to know that if you want to go on that journey, you have to take the essence of Joseph with the bones, the structure. This is what's going to keep us together. This is what's going to keep our people strong, is the ability to see that individual who is the outcast, the rebel, the fraternizes with the enemy, to see that that person is also Hashem's child. And it's my responsibility to find a way to help them recognize that. Meaning to say, the fact that they are so caught up in a toxic environment is only because they're not in touch with who they are. They've bought into all the nonsense of whatever's going around them. They think that if they're going to kiss up to our enemies, they're going to be privileged Jews. And we know from our history that our enemies have never discriminated against those who've tried to befriend them. It's just a matter of how much longer it's taken until they've, you remember the story, maybe you don't, when the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was arrested by the NKVD, or as was called the Yevsektia, which was the Jewish component of the secret police. And the Jewish component was primarily focused on destroying Judaism in Soviet Russia. So when they arrested the previous Rebbe, and they brutalized him, and they wanted him to confess to all kinds of things, crimes against the state, and he really held his ground. At one point in the conversation, the previous Rebbe said to them, do you honestly believe that you're going to be immune from the communist system? And the sad reality is, at the end, the previous Rebbe was released from prison and eventually left the Soviet Union, and his captors were eventually executed by the government. Because that love affair that people have with they have this desperate addiction to the approval of others, and therefore they're willing to sacrifice their own Jewish identity in the hope that everybody else is going to like them. That's never really worked out for us throughout our history. There were capos who went to gas chambers at the end of the day. And so the message really is that when you see an individual who is so disengaged from their Judaism, or worse, is so anti their Judaism, we've got to remember that getting out of Egypt is a matter of taking the essence of Joseph with us. So we have to be able to see in that person that they're a lost individual rather than a toxic individual. And that rather than writing them off, we have to devise some mechanism by which we could just reignite that spark, that they are Hashem's child. And while I may not have the wisdom or the insight or the access to that individual to actually bring them on board, I have to at least have that sensitivity. There's a very interesting halacha. Anybody who's familiar will know that the books of the Shulchan Aruch start with the most common scenarios. It's a code of Jewish law, right? So you're going to start with the most common scenarios and end off with the most unlikely scenarios. So the first part of the Shulchan Aruch will talk about, how you conduct yourself in the morning and what you're supposed to do on a daily basis and how we look after food in Judaism. And then we'll speak about Shabbos. We'll go from the most common to the least common. So all the way at the end, it talks about scenarios of individuals who don't deserve to be saved if their life is in danger. It's a very interesting discussion in halacha, right? So there are certain individuals who are considered halachically to have done so much damage to the Jewish people that if their life is in peril, we are not supposed to save them. That's a halacha. And not only that, sometimes we may even be entitled to execute them. Not nowadays, we don't have a Jewish court per se, but we do know that execution is part of the Jewish concept. So it says that there are certain individuals who are so toxic that ein merachamin aleihem. You're not allowed to show them compassion. You hear that? They are so far gone that you're not permitted to show them compassion. So there's a saying from the fifth Rebbe of Chabad. Can you imagine if there is somebody who the Torah says that you may not show them compassion, can you only imagine how much compassion such a person needs? How much compassion they need. Meaning to say, if in the strictures of halacha there's no room to accommodate them, sometimes we have to go beyond the letter of the law. And that's really the message of here. And the message is, if you want to leave Egypt, you want to be part of the Jewish people, you have to take the essence of Joseph. The essence of Joseph is that person who we think is so disconnected, we have to remind ourselves they are Hashem's child. And if we can, it's our responsibility to show them that that's who they are. And that will make a difference not only to them, it will make a difference to us as well.